Inevitably, when you see anything related to the Malaise era or the fuel crisis, someone will say something to the effect of, Americans were getting tired of the giant gas guzzlers from Detroit and ready to move to the more efficient small cars from Japan. The problem with this statement is not a single aspect of it is actually true. Now I know people are already jumping into the comments to tell me I'm an idiot and that I don't know what I'm talking about. But let's take a look at what actually happened. Let's start with the tired of giant gas guzzlers bit. This should be the easy part to support. After a fuel crisis, its relapse, and a recession leading to record inflation, surely buyers were shifting to smaller, cheaper cars. Well, kinda, in the sense that there was an increase in sales of smaller cars. But sales were up across the board. Mid-size cars saw the biggest increase in market share, with some of the best-selling models on the market. But full-size cars remained the top-selling segment into the mid-'80s, suggesting that buyers were hardly tired of them. And a minor increase in small car sales is not the same thing as a major shift in the market. In fact, it wasn't until the second stage of downsizing, when big cars appeared to become just more expensive versions of mid-size cars, that the mid-size car would become the popular segment. And at no point was the small car the leading segment in the U.S., although by the early 80s, some small cars were top sellers. But as it turned out, buyers were more likely to transition to full-size pickups than small cars. Perhaps it was not big cars, but American cars they were tired of. Well, no. All of the major American brands saw record sales during the Malaise era, with the companies best known for bigger cars, Cadillac, Buick, Oldsmobile, Mercury, Lincoln, and Chrysler, all peaking towards the end of the decade when things were supposedly at their worst. But surely they were losing market share to the Japanese. No, they were not. The only American company to lose market share during the 70s was Ford, and it lost that market share to GM, only to get it back by the mid-'80s. The implications also suggest that Detroit was only making big cars. They were certainly making some of the biggest cars ever by the mid-'70s, at least partially due to new safety regulations. Regulations that would soon also be impacting imports. Even the American compact cars of the period were considered quite large by import standards, with the possible exception of the Ford Maverick and AMC Hornet. But it ignores the fact that the subcompact Pinto, Vega, and Gremlin all predate the fuel crisis. Current opinions of these vehicles aside, at the time they easily outsold their imported competitors. 3 million Pintos, 2 million Vegas, and even the Gremlin sold more than 670,000. And those top-selling small cars of the 80s were still primarily American cars, like the Ford Escort and Chevy Cavalier, outselling even the Civic and Corolla in the U.S. Detroit was also importing several subcompacts before the fuel crisis, but we're not counting those. But perhaps we should. The Mercury Capri was still a Ford after all, and the Buick Opel GM, at least at first, and it would be wrong to overlook the success of the Chevette and others later on. While a significant percentage of Japanese sales in the U.S. were cars sold by American brands, partially due to the fact that the Big Three owned stake in them, for the sole purpose of manufacturing small cars for less money, specifically Mazda, Mitsubishi, and Isuzu, brands that owe their success to their association with American brands, and would struggle after that association ended. So where does this misconception of a Japanese invasion in the 70s come from? It's not that the Japanese invasion didn't happen, it's a question of what, where, and when. First, there was the expansion of Japanese brands during the 70s. Brands such as Toyota, Datsun, Honda, and Subaru saw significant growth on their own, with all the Japanese brands combined having a U.S. market share of around 6% in 1970, growing to about 15% in 1980, with many of them starting from close to zero. Impressive growth, to say the least, and perhaps enough on its own to warrant an invasion designation, but still far from being a threat to the American manufacturers, still being less than a quarter of the Big Three's market share. So you may be wondering, if this market share didn't come from Detroit, where did it come from? Europe. Brands such as Fiat, Lancia, Peugeot, Renault, and others took big hits in the U.S. during the period, with many of them soon leaving the market. And this was not unique to the U.S. market, but was also happening in many parts of Europe, particularly Britain, where the auto industry was falling apart, and where Japanese brands were easily taking control. partially due to a difference in quality, and partially just based on availability, due to constant strikes from local manufacturers. A success they wouldn't see in the US until the 90s. So why is the perception that it happened so much sooner? Well, partially because their growth in the 70s carried through the 80s to get them there in the 90s, and partially because of their early successes elsewhere. In other words, the 70s was the beginning of a relatively quick expanding market, but there were also other factors. Regulations in the late 70s and early 80s saw excessive downsizing for the period that didn't really impact imports, making it appear American brands were trying to compete more with imports, as opposed to meet forced regulations, with corporate average fuel economy regulations coming into play in 1975, requiring average mileage for passenger cars to double in the next 10 years. Not the same thing as being demanded by buyers, but it certainly changed the market. Add that to the fact that record sales and high market share in the 1970s were not amounting to high profits. GM reacted to this with massive cost cutting, intentionally giving up market share to increase short-term profits. Ford threw money at the problem and took over most market segments, at least for a while. Chrysler ended up having to take a government bailout, and AMC would be taken over by Renault. For the most part, not the behavior of market-leading brands, and not surprisingly, damaging long-term reputations. By the time the Japanese had started taking over U.S. market segments, domestic and import models were of similar size and economy, meaning the move was hardly based on the idea of moving to smaller, more economical cars. In fact, by the time the Japanese were leading brands in America, they were offering big luxury cars and V8s, followed not long after by full-size trucks. And by this point, many Japanese cars were considered domestic, and many American cars imports. As it turns out, Americans are still buying gas guzzlers, many made in America, if not from American brands. But you can also buy Japanese and European ones. Although, with more forced regulations, that may change very soon. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.